au Séminaire IMPEC aujourd'hui Susanna TRNKA de l'Université d'Auckland. We're very glad to welcome Susanna TRNKA from University of Auckland today.
Thank you. Thank you. So my title today is Digital Dwelling, How Young New Zealanders Enact Recognition Online. And I want to start off by making a note about the title of my paper. Digital dwelling is obviously a reference to Martin Heidegger's concept of dwelling. As is well known, one of Heidegger's signature moves in talking about the self was to insist upon its need to always be emplaced. In coining his neologism, Dasein, or there being, to replace the notion of the self, Heidegger strove to emphasize the situatedness of existence, indicating that we cannot speak of the self without placing it in its world or context. In being there, rather than simply being, we are always located in, and therefore contingent on, the temporal and spatial there in which we find ourselves. According to Heidegger, Dasein, moreover, is not only is in the world, but dwells within it. Dwelling is fundamentally active. It consists of building and thinking, both reflecting on our world and reshaping it. Dwelling for Heidegger is thus closely linked to technology, as it is through technology that humans reshape the world in which we live. Just as fundamental is our engagement with other people, as Dasein is always also interrelational. And here I actually think other philosophers following Heidegger, such as the Czech philosopher Jan Patočka, did a better job of thinking through the implications of what it means to be among others as a corporeal subject, moving through space and time. But nonetheless, the elements were certainly there in Heidegger's articulation of dwelling. In extending this to consider digital dwelling, my intention is quite simply to examine what happens to embodiment, in particular to emotion and affect, and to interrelationality, when the space inhabited by the I is extended to include digital contexts. Of course, there are many productive ways we could examine this question, but the particular project I'm going to be drawing from today is based on documenting how young people in New Zealand view their presence and the presence of others online in terms of expressions of emotion, interrelationality, and the constitution of the self. Let me get into it by telling you a bit about the communication strategies of a young man I call James. When 22-year-old James has something important to tell his live-in boyfriend, he prefers to disclose it online. He uses Messenger to convey what he calls the big stuff, as a way of managing emotional exchanges. It's easier to talk about your feelings online, he explains, because you can quickly change the topic. James has spent a lot of time considering the best ways to engage in different kinds of emotional disclosures. Indeed, my work with New Zealand youth shows in general a deep awareness, both in terms of self-awareness and awareness of others, of the complexities of emotional communication conducted both on and offline. As a side note, it's worth reflecting on how in the mid-1990s and early 2000s there was a wealth of books that came out and articles depicting young people as so-called digital natives. This was followed by a wave of critiques outlining why this term is problematic, as it assumes that in contrast to older generations, people under the age of 20 back then, now probably those under the age of 40, are somehow inherently comfortable online. But being online, whatever our ages, has its own comforts and discomforts. It also has its own social mores and expectations, as Ilana Gershon so aptly demonstrated in her book, The Breakup 2.0. Rather than considering one generation as being somehow at home in online spaces while another feels out of place, more recent scholarship has revealed that a much more productive question is how digital technologies get used to constitute particular kinds of phenomena for example, our emotional lives, which may or may not differ according to age. I'd like to suggest that while there may or may not be generational differences at play in terms of one's comfort with technology, much more significant to understanding young people's online practices are the ways that young people navigate emotional disclosures and the kinds of emotional ideologies that undergird and emerge from this. I use the word ideology with care to highlight, in the Gramscian sense, both its force and connection to power, as well as how these practices are themselves openly reflected upon and debated, which is another of Gershon's points in the Breakup 2.0. In other words, how young people engage in emotional exchanges is as much a point of debate among youth as is the substance of what these exchanges are about, for example, feeling sad or feeling angry. In-depth conversation about digital technology use with young New Zealanders revealed attentiveness, sustained reflection, and often deep concern over how intimacy is enacted on and offline, suggesting that emotional ideologies may be a more apt term than habit, habitus, or practices. But first, a short bit about methods for the project that I'm talking about today. So what I'm reading to you today is part of a book project based on semi-structured interviews with young New Zealanders between the ages of 14 and 24. A team of us interviewed 235 young people about their views on digital technology use and health. The interviews, which took place between 2015 and 2021, ranged from about 20 minutes to up to 2 hours, but most were close to 1 hour in length. Our interview approach was to allow interviewees to steer the conversations to whatever topics they most wanted to talk about. We thus have interviews focused almost entirely on video gaming, on friendship, or on the nutritional requirements of bodybuilding. The areas of interest that I'm focusing on today are what young people refer to as emotional and social health, including most especially how one communicates with others online. Emotional health as a category emerged from young people's discourses as having two different valences. The first one is working on the self and optimizing one's own emotional state through things like journaling, meditation, running. But young people also noted that recognizing and changing one's emotions does not only lend itself to do-it-yourself projects of emotional optimization, but also depends on working interrelationally with others on one's own as well as on their emotional lives. This too requires a lot of often intense reflection on how and when and via what media one should and should not speak out. And while we all face such dilemmas, I'd like to suggest that this hyper-attentiveness is particularly acute among young people who, rather than being digital natives, are in fact very intensely exploring exactly how and when they feel a particular kind of media is useful for conveying a specific message. All of us across various generations do this, and we obviously did this prior to the internet. Think, for example, of the breakup letter and the decisions that went into whether we broke up with someone face-to-face or in writing. But there's something to be said about the fact that young people are in a stage of life where they're engaging in the creation and dissolution of relationships in ways that are generationally distinctive. Moreover, the affordances of digital technologies add a new dimension, a dimension that keeps rapidly changing as the platforms we use and what each specific one enables, as well as how we view it, change as well. As Gershon suggests, the very novelty of these forms of communication keeps us on our toes, thinking through how and when we feel it is appropriate to use them. This takes me back to James. James is no stranger to the dangers of online communication. In fact, he spent a good bit of his 80-minute interview with us discussing the benefits and challenges of various forms of emotional expression online. Many of his concerns echo those we've collected from other youth. Namely, he feels deeply burnt by the attention-seeking of an acquaintance who posted she was contemplating suicide, but when he reached out expressing concern, as he put it, she was like, "Oh no, I just want people to understand." And pretty much you could tell in everything she was texting me, she just wanted attention. He cringes when he recalls how jokes he made online were misunderstood and he was rebuffed for being mean. He repeatedly uses trigger warnings before discussing difficult issues on and offline. He has his own regrets about what he disclosed in the past, from seeking too much attention to documenting a mental health crisis online. As he put it, "I was always like, oh my God, I hate my life. I sometimes see memories of it, and I'm like, oh my God." You can literally see what happened, because when I was in my first year of university, I had this big crisis. I had red hair, I got piercings, I got my first tattoo. Everyone was like, what the fuck is happening? If something's happening, surely he'll tell us. And in my head, I was like, I'm having a crisis. Some might say that James's expectations of others can be high. As he put it, "I never want to be like my parents, where whenever I send them something, they just send me a thumbs up. And I'm like, can you actually show me that you care?" And yet he too struggles with how best to respond. Sometimes my partner goes on huge rants about how his work is shit, and I'm just like, I don't know what to say, because interacting online is so much different. So sometimes I'll just be like, oh my God, do I say that? Or should I say anything? Because, for example, if your partner has a crisis offline, like in real life, you can just shut up. But if you do it on Facebook and it's seen, it's kind of weird. But I just don't know. I don't know what to just say. Okay, I'm listening. So yeah, it's a bit weird to juggle, but also you don't want to be too loud. And yet when it comes to emotional disclosures of his own to his partner, James prefers to hold them online. And I find this point very intriguing, and I keep circling back to this question: why even hold such discussions online? James lives with his partner, so why hold these sorts of emotional disclosures in online spaces? Particularly when you live with someone or you have close daily contact, why choose this mode of communication? What is it that's being sought out? In trying to find an answer, I find it useful to turn to the work of Paul Ricouer on recognition, as well as the work of Emmanuel Levinas. In the introduction to his book, The Course of Recognition, Ricouer draws from 2 French dictionaries to outline the semantic terrain of this concept. And I'm going to radically simplify here. Ricouer actually gives us more than 23 different definitions, but I'm going to consolidate them into 6, which have, to my mind, key overlapping meanings for how he parses recognition. So first there is recognition as to remember, or to bring again to mind the idea of someone or something, as in, oh yes, I recall that time when, or I recognize I promised to do something. The second is to identify, as in, yes, I recognize that the law says this, or my friend Paul, I didn't recognize you at first. The third is to discover a hidden truth, such as, I didn't know it at the time, but then I recognized, as in my friend Paul, who I haven't seen in many years, or as in an implicit promise I made without realizing I made it at the time. The fourth meaning is to hesitate and then admit, okay, I now recognize you were actually correct. We begin to get a sense here of recognition as sometimes indicating an overcoming, for example, of a hesitation or a hurdle. Recognition, Ricouer suggests, isn't always straightforward, made in the first instance, but it requires action, reflection, the piecing together of something. Let us consider 2 other important, initially perhaps seemingly disparate, but according to Ricouer, actually interconnected dimensions. These are recognition as to grant rights, as in to recognize a child, to be recognized as a citizen, and recognition as to express gratitude. I recognize your contributions to the university. Running through this discussion is a further differentiation, which is then revealed for Ricoeur as in fact a crucial point of unification, namely recognition given versus recognition sought. It is here that a necessarily asymmetrical exchange occurs between the self and the other, an exchange that Ricoeur tells us is fundamental to the process of self-recognition. To speak or declare, for Ricoeur, is in itself simultaneously a way of constituting oneself and how one comes to be heard. As Ricoeur puts it, to speak, in effect, to say something, presupposes an expectation of being heard. Through recognition, one is seen, one is historified, solidified, unified, if you will, through definition 1, and thus identified as a particular actor through definition number 2, whilst granted rights, definition 5, and granted value, definition 6. Drawing from the work of Levinas, but also Hegel, Hannah Arendt, and Axel Honneth, amongst others, Ricoeur outlines mutual recognition as crucial to the constitution of the self as a subject. This is not a straightforward process. Just look at definitions 3 and 4. Central to recognition is the possibility of misrecognition, or of making a mistake, which consists in taking a thing or a person for what it or he or she is not, Ricoeur tells us. He goes on to say, no critical vigilance will ever completely remove this threat of failure, which can also include acts of self-deception. There's thus always a risk that the hurdle, hesitation, or challenge will not be overcome, and this is what makes the enterprise of recognition both a struggle in Honneth's terms and a necessary one. The hurdle is necessary as it is what highlights the gap between us, the inherent asymmetry of our positions. Without it, there'd be no recognition as such, as it is precisely the gap that in Ricoeur's formulation calls attention to the irreplaceable character of each of the parties in the exchange. The one is not the other. We exchange gifts, but not places. A just distance is maintained at the heart of mutuality, a just distance that integrates respect into intimacy. This is where it's useful to take a short detour from Ricoeur and go more in depth into the inspiration he drew from Levinas. For Levinas, to truly recognize you, I must not incorporate you into myself, but remain radically aware of your very otherness. As Ricoeur following Levinas suggests, genuine recognition requires hurdles to overcome. This distanciation keeps us attentive to the other. Awake to possibilities of misrecognition, we are actually able to recognize the other for who they are. Rather than reducing you to categories that are familiar to me, I must always remain open to who you are in this instant, aware that you are ever-changing, as am I. Intimacy is thus not about knowing. It is about the willing suspension of knowing, of being instead open to not knowing, and thus continual discovery of someone else and of myself. This is a point where Levinas interestingly diverges from Ricoeur, in that for Levinas, recognition doesn't need to be mutual. What is crucial is the act of radical openness to the other, which can in fact be one-sided. That said, it does impact on the recognizer as well as the recognized, as this kind of intimacy with the other forces us to look anew at not only who they are, but also at who we are. Not only will they always contain unknowns, but so too do we, as expressed through Levinas's notion of infinity. Thus, through our encounters with the other, intimacy becomes not only interpersonal, but a way of making sense of the self. This idea of radical openness verges on undoing Ricoeur's definitions 1 and 2 of being remembered and identified, as it requires that identification remain fluid. only by maintaining distance as well as closeness, of continually attempting to overcome the hurdle of not knowing in order to know, can such intimacy be achieved. This notion of distance as central to intimacy has been stated with respect to digital communications by the media studies scholar Roger Silverstone. In his discussions of an ethics for cyberspace, Silverstone argues that the possibility of a moral life is dependent upon our capacity to define and sustain a proper distance in the relationships we have between ourselves and others, and that our media technologies can be seen to affect that. Specifically, Silverstone suggests that closeness, even intimacy, does not guarantee recognition or responsibility. It can invite, conceivably, either blank resistance or alternatively incorporation. Indeed, it is only with what Silverstone, drawing upon Levinas, terms proper distance that we can adequately respond to the other as other, or to put it another way, to recognize them as not only who they are, but what they are, that is, not ourselves, or our projection of who we think they are. Silverstone's argument focuses on what he sees as the misrecognition of the connection enabled by the internet as closeness. He urges us to reflect on the gap necessary for true closeness to occur. While I do not wish to conflate the work of Silverstone with that of Ricouer, there's a striking resonance between the two scholars in terms of the attentiveness to the appropriate proximity necessary for recognition to occur. And perhaps I'd like to suggest there's a similar concern at play in the ways that young people like James wrestle with how to enable closeness without collapse, aiming for the just distance that integrates respect into intimacy and enables recognition to occur. Let me draw briefly from another example from one of our interviewees. So this is Alex. Alex, who is 16, defines as non-binary, but is considering a gender transition. Alex is very clear on the distinctions between the kinds of relationships they can build on discussion fora on the internet versus face-to-face. In some online spaces, Alex asserts, they can be more open than elsewhere, as Alex puts it, there's always the hesitancy to bare your deepest, darkest emotions to people. I mean, especially to close friends, because you say something and they're probably going to remember it. You might find yourself saying things that you know you don't really sort of stand by, but they'll remember you saying this thing. It's one of those things where intimacy and closeness, it almost becomes a bad thing with friends. To achieve such forms of recognition face-to-face, one might suggest Alex needs better friends. But more to the point, Alex would need to engage with people, friends or family, who are close to them, but willing to hold them far enough away to enable the hurdle of recognition, a hurdle that requires recognizing that they're not always the person they were. In this case, once a son who is now perhaps transforming into a daughter, once a brother who is becoming a sister, or who will perhaps stay in or move in and out of other categories entirely. Let me go back briefly to James. For all his work as a youth support worker, and for all the emotional explication he engages in throughout his interview, James describes himself as a person who doesn't like to talk about his own feelings. My partner literally knows me for shutting down whenever I'm feeling something, he laughs. But I think it's easier to talk about your feelings online because you can quickly change the topic. And that's how I feel, because sometimes when I say I'm upset, I can go one moment and then go, but anyway, how are you feeling? And I feel like if you're online, this transition would go smoother than in real life. And you're like, in real life, you're like in tears, and you're like, oh, my life is shit, but anyway, how are you? That would not work. And the person would be like, no, you can tell me. And you'd be like, no, it's okay. Sometimes, he suggests, it's precisely that ability to enact emotional containment rather than expression that is needed. The gap enabled by not being face-to-face enables a different kind of closeness and distancing, one that for James as well as Alex is crucial for recognition sought, if not always received. James may question it when others use the same method. Indeed, he reflects, I'm so hypocritical about emotional expression online because I'm like, oh my God, the good time when people could actually talk, be honest with one another. But his reflections on his own need to articulate and be heard, as well as to respond appropriately to another in need, suggests a more nuanced stance on how, when, and by what means emotional disclosures should play out. The main way that young people speak about these exchanges is actually not, though, through the language of digital dwelling, as we may expect, through the ideas of dwelling, which I've brought to this discussion. And while they may flirt around with ideas about recognition, that again is not the central way that most of the young people we spoke about their emotional life. So I want to shift slightly now and move from my own analysis to the way that they conceptualize these kinds of communicative exchanges, and that is through the language of health. If you remember at the beginning of this talk, I said our interviews with young people were specifically about digital technology use and health. Indeed, all of the stories here were collected under that rubric. To me, what I've been talking about so far is relationships, intimacy, care, proximity, vulnerability. This is relationship talk. Now, one could argue that everything is relationship talk, as everything we do to some extent or other involves interrelationality, and I would not argue with that. But young people weren't offering these stories as part of larger narratives about social, emotional, or mental health. The same way, for example, I could ask you to tell me a story about the food you like, and you would tell me about cooking with your mother or father. They were offering these as illustrations of health, more specifically as exemplars of what is emotional, social, and mental health. In answer to the prompt, what is health? They said, in effect, it is how I talk to my friend or with my partner. The relationship isn't incidental here. It is the focal point of what health is. To push the analogy further, it is as if the answer to what is cooking would be, it's spending time in the kitchen with my mother. For example, 2 minutes into the start of their interview, Alex was asked by the interviewer, would you say you ever use the internet for accessing health-related information? To which they replied by describing the positive connections they feel with other members of an online fountain pen group. So Alex initially answers, a fair bit. To which the interviewer prompts, yep, tell me a bit about that. Alex goes on, so one of the big things about the internet is communities. So even if a community isn't specifically health related, it's often quite nice to have sort of communities related to hobbies and stuff. So you have things like fountain pens and mechanical keyboards that people are fans of, and you can find communities where people just talk about that. So you can go and it can be used for escapism because you'll just be talking about keyboards or whatever, pens. When the interviewer explicitly asked Alex if this is related to health, because they were actually a bit confused, Alex hesitated but then answered in the affirmative. Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, 'cause they give you a sense of community. They give you people you can talk to. So there's a couple of usernames that I recognize and I'll be like, oh, I know that person. So there's definitely a sense of community. They can have a long, in-depth discussion about a specific model or a specific pen and just, I don't know, but it just gives you a sense of connection, which some people definitely have a harder time getting these days. From there, Alex embarked on a discussion of their use of gender identity forums, describing how giving advice and support to others often enabled them to recognize their own challenges and strengths more clearly. As Alex put it, helping people out online is always something where it's also like you can learn. Like if you tell people, just do this and do that, and then you start thinking, oh, maybe I should do that myself. And also one of the big things that I did is I started trying to think about myself the way I talk about others. things that wouldn't, under any circumstances, be acceptable to say to another person, I started thinking, well, why should I say that to myself? By recognizing how to respectfully treat others, Alex begins to recognize how to treat themselves. All of this, what Alex and James and others have been talking about, illustrates what is actually the most significant finding of the current project I'm doing, to my mind, namely that what we think of and call health has changed in the last generation or so. It seems to me that the category of health has been growing in New Zealand as well as elsewhere in the West, a phenomenon that I refer to as healthization, and that's actually the name of the book that this paper is a part of. Here's just one example. This is Michael. Asked what he thinks about health, Michael recounted, I was taught in high school about the house model of the 4 walls of health, the emotional, mental, social, physical, and I think it's very true. I think for me personally, they're all really important, but I think I just tend to focus more on physical and social, like physical well-being, eat, sleep, exercise, social well-being, hang out with your mates. Mental and emotional is more in depth, I guess. It's harder to do. Other young people in their discussions of health referred to several other forms of health: sexual health, social media health, academic health, financial health, spiritual health, for example. Amber, for example, went into great detail into the physical aspects of health, but then also added social health, such as catching up with your friends. And then there's like spiritual health as well. I'm not super into that, she said, but that definitely is part of health for some people. I think just having time for yourself, letting yourself rewind, recharge, is good as well. This expansive language of health mirrors global trends, at least in English-speaking countries, and I'd be interested if it's the same in France. But if you look at English-speaking countries, the popular American psychology journal Psychology Today describes health as a Greek temple held up by 3 pillars of physical, mental, and social health. The website of the largest Western American hospital and family physician providers, Banner, offers 8 tips to take care of your spiritual health. In the UK, the Royal Society for Public Health has been lobbying for a report on social media and youth mental health, arguing for the establishment of a social media health alliance. As facets of health, relationships are something that young people feel ethically compelled to work on and improve, or at the very least to maintain to a good standard. Many, moreover, do so in the name of an overarching value of what they refer to as balance, suggesting that while neoliberal ideologies that emphasize productivity are important, for young people, at least in New Zealand, they're tempered by the value of balancing various aspects of life in order to stay healthy. I'm not going to read the whole list, but this is one young man, Cameron, a 20-year-old law student, and this is how he described trying to remain healthy. I've always tried to balance everything in terms of studies, sport, extracurricular, that kind of thing. I'll allocate certain hours each week between friends, sport, motorcycle riding, things like being on committees for clubs, and he goes on and on and on. He says, just hanging out with friends, I've got a girlfriend, so that's, I don't know if that's stressful or not stressful, but that's nice as well. I try and allocate an hour or an hour and a half each day to spend with my girlfriend, and then he has time for committees, and then he has time for his university work. This is a calendar that was described to us. This isn't her actual calendar. You can find many models online, but a young woman named Elise described to us how she used this Google Calendar to track the different activities, from social activities, church, hours in the gym. She said, I've got notations of how I'm doing, so like knowing that I've got balance. I know I've got balance by looking at my calendar. I have everything in different colors, so if I look at a week, I can see if I've got balance between university, work, social life, family, church. If I've got too many colors, you can see how the work has overloaded the week and I've got no social. I know that's not a good idea. when asked by the interviewer, "Would you consider your calendar a health technology for mental well-being?" Elise replied, "Well, yeah, I use it like that, for balance. So it's not strictly a health app or a website, but it's not just tracking my appointments, it's tracking what category they fit into. My boyfriend uses her own Google Calendar as well. We've synced ours because it would actually help him to know where I was during the week. I definitely use my calendar as some sort of mental health prediction and also to ask, am I doing okay? Because, balance is one of the things that's a serious issue for lots of people. It's kind of my monitoring thing. And he, because he's synced to her calendar, would also be able to see, do I need to take a break? For me, a lot of things stand out in this exchange, not least of all, how keeping tabs on Elise's mental health has become a collaborative effort between herself and her boyfriend. But for our purposes here, what is key is the various facets of health that are required to be healthy. It seems to me that for young people, at least in New Zealand, there's been a decided change in the tenor of what we envisage when we talk about our health. The bar of being healthy has been set a lot higher, as well as the expectations around what we should be doing to reach it. In part, we can trace this expansion of the facets of health through the rising popularity of the concept of well-being, whose usage has skyrocketed over the past 20 years, and which now seems to be attached to everything. If it isn't about health, it's about health and well-being. But most of the young people we spoke with did not actually use well-being very much. They used health to talk about things like happiness, friendships, romantic relationships, running, wearing lipstick to spread a good vibe, a good feeling. All of these are examples that came up in our interviews. So on the one hand, we're arguably embracing much more holistic models of what we mean by health, perhaps finally coming close to the World Health Organization's 1948 definition of health as not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, but a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. On the other hand, this radical expansion of what we must do to retain or grow health suggests a much broader healthization of life. And if you think I'm overstretching here, I note that in both New Zealand and in the UK, doctors can now engage in social prescribing, which basically involves giving patients referrals to engage in non-clinical activities to improve their health. For example, taking part in programs that focus on doing art projects, gardening, cooking classes, volunteering, but also something like befriending. Medical sociologists such as Peter Conrad have long warned us of the increasing medicalization of life. This is something a bit different though, which is why I think of it as healthization. Healthization certainly shares aspects of medicalization, but it extends even further. Beyond the interests of medical institutions and practitioners, it involves the interests of app developers, self-help gurus, insurance companies, influencers, education specialists and policymakers, and most importantly, the interests of people, including young people themselves. It also involves activities that young people do not want any medical advice on, such as how to meditate or what lipstick to wear to look beautiful, but nonetheless they consider these as integral to their health. It thus involves, to my mind, a much more diverse set of interests, as health rather than medicine is something everyone can envision having a stake in. As part of healthization, there is an associated moralization of a huge variety of domains of life. As the scholarly work on patient responsibility reminds us, health has long been viewed as a moral enterprise, and today is no exception. With the rise of patient-centered medicine, health is now our individual or familial responsibility. As a society, we view health as something we need to invest in, and by that I mean not only government, but how we ourselves as individuals or families are expected to focus on fitness and nutrition, are expected to put together an emotional toolkit to help us through stressful times, and are coming to be expected to ensure we have good relationships, stay sexually healthy, mind our social media use so it's not too much but also keeps us connected, ensure we stay active in our communities and seeing our friends. Putting all of this under the rubric of health attaches different kinds of values to it. One isn't just unsuccessful in romantic relationships or struggling to make friends. Now it is bad for their health. No longer is this a question of whether or not we might attain a good life. It is a health issue. Of course, some of us have more opportunities and resources to achieve health than do others. There are clearly structural vulnerabilities when we approach health in this way. But there are also other kinds of vulnerabilities at play when we begin to talk about a myriad of different aspects of life through the lens of health speak. As a society, we're in the midst of a mass movement to healthicize facets of life that had not been medicalized before, holding them up to a different kind of scrutiny and goal orientation, leading to judgments around whether we've worked on them enough, and overlooking the impacts of structure as well as serendipity. In sum, all of these strands were there before, but in bringing them together and saying, this is health, we are in effect saying to ourselves, this is where I should be, and if not, it's where I should aim to get myself, and if I don't get there, that's because I didn't try hard enough. At least that's as far as the rhetoric in New Zealand is being voiced. So what is at stake in this newfound healthization? That depends in part on what we collectively come to recognize or identify as health or well-being. And here I'm explicitly invoking Ricouer's definition number 2. As Ricouer underscores, recognition is necessarily fluid. We might recognize some facet of life as health at one point in time, only to determine this to be a misrecognition at another. I'd like to suggest that in facing this new understanding of health, we need to actively and collectively engage in the work of recognition, asking ourselves, where are the boundary lines when it comes to health? Should health be composed of climate change, planetary health, anti-poverty activism, anti-racism? Should it involve friendship, romantic and sexual relationships, emotional recognition? Or are these, while nonetheless important, even vital aspects of life, best grappled with outside the realms of health, illness, and disease? In addition to understanding how conceptualizations of health are changing, we have an opportunity here, I think, to create a space for thinking through what's currently included as well as what's missing, and going back to Gramsci and language ideologies, what is at stake here and for whom? Let me return one final time to James, reflecting for a moment on how we got from his description of the careful judgments he makes about online and offline emotional disclosures to a discussion of the multifaceted nature of health. One explanation is to underscore how James, Alex, Cameron, Elise, like many other young New Zealanders, view fostering good relationships to be an important, vital aspect of their social, emotional, and mental health. But even more fundamentally than that, I'd like to suggest that many of these accounts demonstrate how recognition itself has come to be viewed as part of health. Receiving and providing recognition of one's emotions, one's identity, one's mental health struggles, being recognized as a queer or trans person, as suffering from anxiety, being culturally recognized as part of a specific cultural or ethnic group, or even recognized as having special knowledge about fountain pens, have all come to fall under the rubric of health, rather than, for example, rights. The fact that young people are living their lives considering that this is part of what it is to be healthy, and at the same time that health is something they can and should be continually actively working on, to the point of constructing their weekly schedules around it, I think constitutes a new generational phenomenon, one that has the power to transform contemporary understandings of what it is to be healthy. Rather than leading a digital revolution, younger generations are ushering in a health revolution that is likely to radically rewrite future understandings of health. But it is also, and just as significantly, underscores significant changes in how interrelationality is conducted as we move in between online and offline spaces, each with its own affordances and emergent ethics and etiquettes of care. If, as Heidegger suggested, who we are is fundamentally shaped by where we are, then we have much to learn from young people's attunement to how digital technologies can reshape the possibilities for recognizing others and for recognizing oneself. Thank you.